Welcome to the Mount Zion Cemetery in Mount Zion, Georgia. My name is Jonathan Dorsey and I grew up here in Mount Zion and at Mount Zion United Methodist Church. I'm glad to have a few moments to share with you here in the historic heart of our hometown. The cemetery was founded in 1865 along with the church. Since then, the Mount Zion Cemetery has become the final resting place of many of the main characters in this northwestern Carroll County community's story. There are statesmen, businessmen, soldiers and educators, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, neighbors and family. The best place to start would be the gravesite of Dr. Hicks Martin, who lived from 1822 to 1914, because without Dr. Martin, we wouldn't have much to discuss today. Dr. Martin founded Mount Zion Methodist Church in 1865 and served as the church's first minister. He is buried in an appropriate place of honor in the cemetery behind the church's pulpit. Besides Dr. Martin, there are 7 other ministers that served Mount Zion Church buried in the cemetery, including Alton Smith, W.C. Walker, Richard Lumsden, L.D. Hamill, Peter Groover, David Intrican, and Dr. Martin's grandson, C.Q. Martin. Adjacent to Dr. Martin's grave is that of Dr. James Mitchell, who was born in Ireland and lived from 1818 until 1903. Dr. Mitchell made his indelible mark on Mount Zion's history as the founder of Mount Zion Seminary, the church-owned and operated school that was the forerunner of today's Mount Zion schools in the Carroll County school system. Before that, Dr. Mitchell served as a member of President Lincoln's administration. After the war, this noted educator came to Georgia and, inspired by the educational fervor at Mount Zion Methodist Church, founded the seminary. Dr. Martin and Dr. Mitchell, two giants of Mount Zion's history, rest appropriately in the community they did so much to create, foster, and serve, almost side by side. Nearby lies William Intrican, resting now in land that was once his own. It was he who gave the property on which the church and cemetery were built. His son, Joseph Intrican, gave the land for the seminary and served as the school's first president of the Board of Trustees. James Roy Martin, Mr. J. Roy as almost everyone called him, was Dr. Hicks Martin's great-grandson and a graduate of the seminary. Mr. J. Roy continued his family's legacy of service to the community through most of the 20th century. Mr. Martin became the oldest Peace Corps volunteer from Georgia when he volunteered with the organization in the 1960s. Those of us who are old enough recall fondly Mr. Martin's annual singing of Silent Night in German at the church's Christmas program. Mr. J. Roy was a farmer, a writer, a scholar, and a true pillar of the community, as was his great-grandfather. Dr. Herbert Bowen was the district superintendent of the Carroll Circuit of the Methodist Church. His 2-story house on Henderson Street was the first in Mount Zion to get electricity in 1928. These pioneers make it easy to see what an important part the church and its members played in the creation and development of Mount Zion. There are many soldiers buried in the Mount Zion Cemetery, patriotic combatants who fought the good fight and now rest here in peace. My dad likes to say Captain Johnson's grave holds 3 people because Captain Johnson served in the Mexican War, later became a Texas Ranger, and then was a captain in the Confederate cavalry from Texas during the Civil War. 3 lives lived by one man. Captain John Wesley King was a student at Bowdoin College, just through the woods from Mount Zion. The captain fought in the Civil War, hence his rank, but after the war, Captain King became an entrepreneur and invented a special type of cotton gin and traveled through the South selling it. James Putnam was a miller by trade. He initially served in the Civil War for the Confederacy and was captured by the North. He then enlisted and served in the U.S. Army for the remainder of the war. Mr. Putnam's story is just one example of the great uncertainty, confusion, and divisions the war between the states caused across the country and in Carroll County. At the Georgia Convention on Secession, Carroll County voted no to seceding from the Union, but when the majority of the state voted yes, Carroll sent her men to fight on the southern side. The presence just a few yards from many of these Southern soldiers of Dr. Mitchell, who was a member of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, is another reminder of the complicated nature of the war. The first Carroll Countian killed in World War II is buried here in the Mount Zion Cemetery. James Brock was killed in a military plane crash in Brazil in February of 1942, just a few months into the war, on his way to service in Africa. A short distance from the church was, for decades, another central focus of life in Mount Zion, Gammon Brothers Groceries. The epitome of the small-town general store, Gammon's was a central gathering place and a place of commerce, gossip, and news for generations of Mount Zion residents. The brothers, Jack, Merle, Clifford, T.H., and Wiley Gammon, are all buried here in the Mount Zion Cemetery. Wiley founded the store, and all of them ran it over the years. Each also served the community in other ways. Jack drove a school bus for the Mount Zion schools. Merle served as Carroll County School Board chairman for many years. Clifford also drove a bus and was choir director and music leader at Mount Zion United Methodist Church, and T.H. was a former Mount Zion mayor. The zip code for Mount Zion's post office is 30150, a number synonymous to many Mount Zion residents with Mrs. Opal Stokes. Mrs. Stokes served as Mount Zion postmaster for many years, a small town's connection to the great world at large in a succession of very small buildings. C.C. Perkins was a prominent local attorney and served for several years in the state legislature. He was a passionate, lifelong advocate for his home community. While he was in the General Assembly, Mr. Perkins led the way to getting the city of Mount Zion, whose corporate charter had lapsed, rechartered in 1953. He was one-time director of the Veterans Administration in Carroll County, Mount Zion city attorney and judge, and served on the Carroll County School Board, where he repeatedly fought against consolidation of the smaller schools of Mount Zion, which had descended from Dr. Mitchell's seminary. He thereby helped preserve the legacy of Mitchell, Martin, and the other pioneers of Mount Zion. The roll call of those buried in the Mount Zion Cemetery is a cast of characters too big for us to discuss each in detail. But hopefully, our video walk through some of Mount Zion's more interesting chapters today will remind us of all the characters who have played important parts in our community's story. As for the cemetery itself, several years ago, the membership of Mount Zion United Methodist Church made the decision to separate the cemetery from the church and transfer the cemetery property and cemetery fund for perpetual care to the nonprofit Mount Zion Cemetery Incorporated. The cemetery is now managed by a board of directors which oversees the sale of lots, upkeep of the grounds, and other improvements. On behalf of the cemetery board, the church, and my hometown, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey through the past and invite you to come and visit this peaceful place where history lives in the names and the stories you'll find here.